Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the September Sustainability Lab virtually at T-Rex. Today we'll be talking about reducing food waste with Jess, the director of Earth Day 365, and Maggie, the education coordinator at Earthways Center, and Bob Henkel, who's the programs manager at Earth Day. I assume will probably chime in occasionally. And my name is Aaron Young. I'm the Sustainability Planning Manager at East West Gateway Council of Governments. So without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to, I think Maggie is going first to talk about why for reducing our food waste.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I'm Maggie McCoy. I'm the Education Coordinator at Earthway Center of Missouri Botanical Garden, like Aaron was saying. So we're the sustainability division of the garden. And this part's going to be a little crazy because Bob covered a lot in the trivia, and it sounds like many of you know your stuff already. So hopefully I can still add some background information, but I'm going to kind of give some background about why reducing food waste is an issue and why we should care about it as well. And then Jess is going to cover a lot more of what they've been working on within the region to actually improve messaging around wasted food. So I'm going to share my screen just because I have some slides to share. Okay, perfect. So we talked about this a little bit during the trivia, but just sort of like trying to understand what the issue with food waste is. And all these numbers are from the EPA's numbers in 2018. But this was looking at municipal solid waste generation throughout the United States. That's what the MSW abbreviation is. And I like to think of municipal solid waste as normal everyday trash. It's not construction waste or some other special waste that's out there. It's just what comes from our homes and businesses, normal everyday trash. And in the US, we made about 292.4 million tons of MSW in 2018, with about 38% of it being diverted for recycling or composting. So obviously those numbers vary from state to state and region to region, depending on what services are provided or what local regulations are, but that's kind of what it is across the board, which ends up being about 4.9 pounds of waste total generated per person per day, which is quite a lot to think about. The graph that's on there shows total municipal solid waste. So that also includes what goes to composting and recycling. So about 21.5% what we generate in the United States as waste is food, which is a crazy number to think about, but it's a pretty big amount of waste. Only paper and paperboard are ahead of that. But when we think about what actually goes into our landfills, about, across the United States, around 24% of what goes into our landfills is going to be food waste. And we talked a little bit earlier about, why food waste might be an issue in landfills. But one of the really big issues is that landfills really try and contain waste. That's their job. They're not giant green compost piles. So they do their best to squeeze out as much air as possible so that they have more space to put in waste. When that happens, a lot of stuff breaks down anaerobically or without oxygen because there's not air down there. And that's what creates methane within landfills. So especially when you have a lot of food waste going into landfills, you get a generous amount of methane production from that food waste in those landfills. So it's really something to think about as we're considering waste and how it goes into our landfills. The other portion of this, and we talked about this as well, and during trivia, was thinking about what types of food are wasted, and overall, what's going to end up going to our landfills is going to be things like produce is sort of overwhelmingly, so think fruits and veggies, because that's the stuff that goes bad the fastest. Sometimes it's sold in certain quantities, so people have a hard time controlling how much they buy, depending on what store you go to. But lots of reasons why produce ends up going to waste first. Things like dairy and eggs are up there as well. Fresh meat and seafood is a type of food that's wasted as well. It's a lower percentage, but it costs so much more. It tends to be a larger percentage of like the actual cost of what gets thrown away. So again, if you are looking, what should you eat first in your fridge? That produce tends to be the first one because it tends to go bad the fastest. And these numbers were from Refed, and I have a couple of other graphics from them as well, but they're a pretty good source of information if you're just looking for general things online. And sort of why is wasted food a problem? And you'll hear me go back and forth between using food waste and wasted food. We should be using wasted food because that talks about food that could have been eaten but didn't get eaten. And food waste might, bring about the idea of eggshells, which most of us aren't necessarily going to be consuming. So why is wasted food a problem? It's sort of like the perfect storm of issues of sustainability. So about a sustainability model, that's sort of like that 3-pillar model, or like the 3-legged stool that includes people, planet, and prosperity, and those 3 things coming together to be sustainability. Wasted food really hits all 3 of those areas, and not just in a little way. So when we think about how many people in the United States are food insecure, and this number fluctuates year to year and certainly went up last year, but we have at least 14 to 16% of households in the United States are food insecure. So when we send 1.3 billion with a B pounds of food to the landfill, that's edible, that's food that could have been used to feed hungry people if we could work out the logistics of how to get it there. So that's a really big issue where we could be sort of securing the future of people and how they're able to eat with this wasted food. It's really bad for the planet, and we'll look at some of those stats a little bit later, but it squanders sort of all of these resources throughout the supply chain. So if we think about water, land, fuel, the pollution that comes from fuel, electricity, labor from people, if we're not eating that food, but we're spending all that time growing it, we're just wasting all those resources that went into producing it. And then the other piece of it is sort of like, if we're going to come down to it, is what we're spending on what we're just trashing in the end of things. So landfill food ends up costing around 161 billion, again with a B, dollars per year. And the stat that we used in the trivia, but it was from a paper that came out last year looking at food waste that gets thrown away, and it looks like about $1,300 per year per consumer is basically what we're throwing away in terms of food. So when you think about stuff that you're cleaning out your fridge or you're throwing it away, on average, it adds up about to $1,300 a year. So figuring out how to reduce that is going to save people money overall as well. So, wasted food is just, if we could figure out how to solve this problem or even cut it in half, we'd be going a long way to like solving 3 really big issues that we have. These are also from Refed, but we talked about in the United States, wasted food or uneaten food is about 4% of US greenhouse gas emissions. It's about 14% of all freshwater use, 18% of all cropland, and 24% of all landfill inputs. That's the food that we throw away, not just like total food production, but everything we're throwing away. So it's a huge drain on our land and water resources, especially. And the other thing that I think makes wasted food interesting as a sustainability issue is that a lot of it actually happens within our homes. I think a lot of times when we look at certain sustainability issues, they might be on a larger systemic level or at a level that maybe as an individual, we just have a tiny piece of. And there's certainly some of that within wasted food within the United States, but the largest percentage of food waste, so about 37%, actually happens within our homes. So it's after we brought it home from the grocery store, after we bought it from a restaurant, and it's come in our front door, 37% is happening with us. So making sure that we're sort of figuring out how at a consumer level we can sort of impact this is really important as well. The other thing is it kind of cuts across all these issues of sustainability as well. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. But when we think about a framework for how we move forward as a globe in terms of sustainability, wasted food cuts across a lot of areas here with our UN goals for trying to achieve sustainability. So certainly the one that sort of rises to the top is this idea of zero hunger. And throughout the world, there's lots of reasons that food is wasted. I'm going to focus mainly on the United States, and I think Jess is going to be as well, just because that's what's relevant to where we live. But across the globe, throughout the supply chain, there's lots of issues with wasted food, and if we could solve those, it would go a long way to eliminating hunger, making sure that people are healthy and have good well-being, making sure there's clean water and sanitation, especially with our use of water in terms of growing food, would help to reduce a lot of inequalities. We'd be more responsible with our consumption and production. It has a huge effect on life on land. There's really big climate implications we're about to talk about with wasted food. There's just, and you could continue to connect to many, many, many other areas here that wasted food has something to do with, but it kind of cuts across a lot of these areas of sustainability and is really connected to a lot of things. So trying to figure out how we can fix this or sort of zero in on it is really important. Thinking about climate, and I think this was the one when I first started looking at wasted food and really getting into it, was just blew me away. I had just no idea what food's impact was on the climate. So the resource I always use for this is looking at Project Drawdown, which is this online project. It was also a book that really looks at existing solutions to climate change and sort of looking at, if we adopt certain things that already exist or certain technologies that already exist, how much greenhouse gas emissions could we save? And they measure it in carbon dioxide equivalents. But they basically look at, what's the biggest bang for our buck? So if we're going to put energy and effort into solutions, where are we going to get the most good out of it? And so they sort of ranked things based on how many greenhouse gas emissions we could save. And then they looked at, in scenario 1, do we just want to have 2 degrees Celsius of warming? Scenario 2 being 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, and they're modeling. And when you look at 2 degrees of warming, reducing food waste is the singular #1 solution to climate change, which is crazy to think about. And that doesn't even include composting. Reducing food waste is literally just eating more of the food that we've spent time growing, right? Composting is a whole nother solution. So this is really about how do we eat the food that was grown for us to eat. This is about saving 50 to 75% of our food waste and reducing that by 2050. So they model over 30 years. It's not 100% or 90%. You could cut your food waste in half, or as a globe, we could cut our food waste in half, and we would save about 87 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent over 30 years. So it's not 100% reduction. We're just asking for half, right? And that number is really big and hard to conceive of. So when we think about a gigaton, we think about an Olympic-sized swimming pool. A lot of people watch the Olympics this year, so we kind of have a picture of this. You kind of have to imagine what the water in that pool weighs, which is difficult to imagine, but try to imagine how much that water weighs. If we put together 400,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, that would be about 1 gigaton of water. So when we talk about cutting our food waste in half, saving us 87 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions, that's a huge deal, and why it ends up being that #1 solution to climate change in a lot of the modeling. So it's so important to think about what are the strategies, what are the solutions we can use to help reduce that food waste, because it's really important to all these different factors when we look at sustainability and also our climate. Now, how do we do this? And I know Jess is going to get into this, but I'm just going to talk about a couple things here because I mentioned them with Project Drawdown. We use the EPA food recovery hierarchy a lot as our guide. And it sort of goes from most preferred to least preferred, starting with source reduction, so just reducing surplus food. And then looking at how do we feed hungry people and how do we feed animals. And that top part is really talking about managing food. and where we're going to get the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but also sort of the biggest savings in terms of helping to feed people, in terms of savings on resources, on money, all of those things. So when we live in the top half of that pyramid, we're really talking about managing food and getting it where it needs to go so that people get what they need, and that our animals are also getting fed as well. The bottom half is looking at, energy recovery from food scraps, composting, and landfill, right? And I think people are always a little bit surprised when they see composting in the bottom half. They're like, composting is so good, and I love composting, and composting is great. I'm not telling anyone to not compost. But once we get to composting, we're really looking at how food as waste to a certain extent, or maybe an input to another process, but we're not eating it, which was its intended purpose, right? So we're thinking about, what do we do now with this food that we've already said that we're not going to eat, and we're basically looking for a place to put it or throw it away. So we really want to spend less time here and more time in our managing food as we're thinking about our solutions. And as Jess will share, this is also something that